Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. We are so excited to be able to have this panel discussion for you or with you this evening. And we thank everybody who has joined on and is a part of what I think is going to be a pretty lively conversation this evening. So I am Sarah Scarborough, and I am the founder and director of Real Life. And Real Life works with folks coming out of adverse situations that are from former incarceration, homelessness, and battling a substance use disorder. And we help men and women with what they need to really get back on their feet. And so we know dealing with the criminal justice system, there's a lot of things and sentencing disparities and just a lot of things that really need to be talked about to educate the public, because we believe that a lot of folks just don't realize what's going on. And then after we kind of talk about the problem, we can act on it and we can come up with some more solutions in order to address some of the situations and issues. So the purpose of tonight is really to just raise an awareness. We have an incredible panel with some very diverse experiences. And so I want to introduce to you who we have on our panel so you can get to know them just a little bit better, and then we will just roll right into conversation. So first up, we have Maurice Washington, who is a graduate of our program and are one of the house managers of our recovery transitional houses. So Maurice, you want to say a word or two to introduce yourself further?
Yeah, my name is Maurice. I'm 35 years old. I was introduced to the Real Life program when I was incarcerated some years back. Kind of changed. I did a 180 in my life. I currently have a business selling holistic herbs, selling natural herbs, and came a real long way. And I can thank the Real Life program for that. I have 5 kids, and well, I'm eager to get into this discussion.
Awesome. Thank you, Maurice. And sitting right next to you is Van Fakens. Van has been with us for several years as well in many different capacities. So with that, Van, you want to share a little bit more about yourself?
Yes, as you all know, my name is Van. Been in and out of prison for the last 30 years, just lost in the street. But what was March 2017? That's when my life changed. I was arrested for selling heroin and cocaine, and I got into the Real Life program, and I said, I need to change. I need to turn my life around. And my life has changed dramatically. I have my own business now. I have my own landscaping business. I've got 2 automobiles. I got an apartment. Life is good. I'm just so happy for the opportunity, because I could be in a prison cell right now if I wasn't, given the opportunity. So I just thank Real Life, and I just try to help everyone that I can that's in the program.
Awesome. Thank you, Van. So glad to have both you and Maurice with us today. Next up, we have Tom Barbour. Tom is a defense attorney that we truly have the privilege and honor of working with often. And he's also the executive director of the Virginia Holistic Justice Initiative, which I also have the privilege of being on the board for. So Tom, I'll toss it over your way.
Hey, thanks, Sarah, and thanks to everyone for being here and for having me on. I really do appreciate the opportunity. My name is Tom Barbour, and I am a local defense attorney. I also used to be a prosecutor for the city of Richmond under Mike Herring, who's also graciously joined us. And that was an interesting experience because Mike allowed me the flexibility to prosecute differently, and to think about why people were involved in the testimony when I was prosecuting the case. And I took that experience and I spun out of the office and started a nonprofit in the city called the Virginia Holistic Justice Initiative. which is gearing up to make the argument publicly that we should not be incarcerating non-violent people in the justice system. So I've been working on that for about 2 years now. We've hired our first full-time caseworker. We just restarted in-person services once Virginia entered phase 3 of its COVID response, and it's been going really well. So I appreciate the opportunity to be here and bring that perspective into this discussion.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tom. You mentioned Mike Herring, who I think most Richmonders are well aware of who he is and the great work that he did as prosecutor of the city of Richmond, and now he is a trial lawyer. So with that, Mike, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Sarah. Hi, everybody. It's nice to be here. This is a good conversation. You know, it's. I think we would all agree that the circumstances that gave rise to this conversation are tragic and unfortunate. Nevertheless, it appears that out of that tragedy is going to come some change, or at least some good discussion around change. I've been a lawyer for almost 30 years. I can't believe how fast the time has gone by. And over the course of those 30 years, I've prosecuted and done criminal defense work at various levels and in various courts. And I'm currently now in private sector, but still working here in the city of Richmond.
Thank you so much. And last up, but certainly not least, we have Amari Harris. Amari brings an incredible just knowledge and insight to this conversation tonight. He is the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Attorney for the Virginia Indigent Defense Fund. Amari? Hey, Amari, your mic is muted. Can't hear you. Nope. For some reason, we're not able to hear you right now. We could hear you earlier. Gotta love technology, I tell ya. So we will. It looks like you're muted now.
Hear me now?
Yes, perfect. There we go. There we go.
Last but not least. Okay, let's try this again. Yes, my name is Amari Harris. I am the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Attorney for the Virginia Indigent Defense Commission. I started out about 6-7 years ago now in the Richmond Public Defender's Office. I transitioned into civil rights litigation and continuing to do criminal defense work and court-appointed work. I opened up my own firm for a short period of time, and then I was brought back to the Indigent Defense Commission. Once again, my name is Mark, diversity work. So glad to be here, glad to talk about the issues that we have on the table, and looking forward to a lively discussion.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. And ladies and gentlemen, that is our fantastic panel for this evening. So we really want to start out because we understand that, you know, every day all of us on this panel are entrusted with this work. We see it, we hear it, we live it, we breathe it. And so I think sometimes we kind of forget that other people sometimes are not so entrenched in this, and that some folks just don't have the opportunity to even learn and understand how things go and what some of the statistics and issues are that are associated with it. So with that, Amari, I'm going to kick it back to you and ask if you can share some of that information before we dive even deeper.
All right. Assuming everybody can hear me? Okay, good. All right. So a couple of issues I think we're dealing with tonight is one that Blacks are arrested more than twice as often as whites. Per capita, at least, Blacks are 5 times more likely to be arrested. So I think the statistics we have are from the Virginia DOC, Department of Corrections, where, you know, upwards of 1,200 or 1,300 people per 100,000 African Americans are arrested, where it's just over 250,000, I believe, for white Americans. And Blacks are sentenced to nearly 20% more time in prison, according to the U.S. Sentencing Commission, which is obviously not the Virginia Sentencing Commission, which, interesting to know, does not track race in their sentencing, not because they haven't been asked. So if anybody wants to ask the Virginia Sentencing Commission to track race for the statistics, you can do that by contacting your legislator or maybe even the Virginia Sentencing Commission. And so I guess the question here is, why is our criminal justice system tolerant of these disparities? I would say that there's a number of reasons. I think the historical, and systemic racism is obviously what we're here to talk about to a large degree. But I think what has happened is that the criminal justice system has kind of created this shroud of legitimacy around, what I think is probably one of the last vestiges of slavery when you're talking about the prison system. Under the 13th Amendment, slavery is abolished, unless you're duly convicted of a crime. At that point, you are allowed to be enslaved, and there is, free labor that is institutionalized in our criminal justice system. So I think that there are certainly some parties that are invested in having the system be the way that it is. Because if it wasn't, then there would be a lot more people questioning it. And now that things are kind of coming more to the forefront, I think more people are in support of not just criminal justice reform, but law enforcement reform. But on top of that, when we're thinking about, what was the original purpose of law enforcement, I heard a very interesting discussion on a Facebook conversation with the chief of police out in Norfolk. I can't recall his last name at the moment. But he was saying, law enforcement, we want to get away from these kind of being these agents of, social enforcement, of being the police of the poor people, being the police of the mentally disabled and things of that nature. And so it seemed that, I think there's a coming to Jesus moment at this point where people are realizing that the way that our systems are designed, it either intentionally or just systemically impacts individual races more than others. And, certainly I think we're ripe for change at this point.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for that background and insight. When my husband and I were talking about this, he brought up something that was so simplistic, but made so much sense. And he just said, are Blacks genetically wired to commit more crime? And we all know the answer is absolutely not. And knowing that and seeing how much higher the numbers are, there's something going on. There's something that is not right. There's something that is not okay. And so, that perspective really made me sit and think, I think maybe even deeper than I had thought about before, and really look at some of the analytical challenges that there are, and the rates that are associated with race. So with that, Tom, I will ask you to provide some feedback on that.
Sure. So I'm gonna nerd out on you guys for a second here and talk about statistics a little bit. And I want to be upfront about the reason why I'm doing that and my background for doing it. I am a bit of an odd defense attorney in that I have a master's of business administration as well from the Darden School for UVA. And while I was there, I was surely not the strongest mathematical student, but I did take multiple courses in understanding these statistics at the managerial level and how to use them. And my concern about statistics like this is that they paint the picture historically accurately, so that our criminal justice system has historically racist and oppressive origins. My worry now in our modern execution of that system is that essentially, if the powers that be believe that acute racism, and I use that word to distinguish sort of overt, instant racism from long-term historical effects of enslavement and oppression of Black people in this country, which I will refer to as systemic racism. My concern is that the powers that be will get up there and say, well, gosh, you know what? I think we just need to send our police officers to a few more sensitivity courses and everything will be fine. And that's not going to be good enough. I sympathize with the police really only in one regard, and that is they're not built for this. You know, when the Norfolk police chief says that he doesn't want to be the police of poor people or people with mental health issues or people with substance abuse issues, etc., I would say that's probably because his unit isn't trained or equipped for that. They're trained or equipped to encounter so-called criminals, but that's not really what they find on the street. They find people going through real life struggles and real life problems. And the analytical challenge with race as a variable in comparing issues like how often Blacks are arrested as compared to whites, or how often Blacks are imprisoned as compared to whites, and things like that, is that, like Sarah said, there's nothing about skin tone that drives criminality. There certainly is not. But there is something about skin tone in the United States that has driven certain people with those certain skin tones into hundreds of years of enslavement and legalized oppression, and has landed them over multiple generations in the conditions today that tend to invite criminal allegations. And so when you talk about race as a variable in comparing arrest rates, for example, you have to be very careful about why those people are being arrested. It's not because they have Black skin. It's probably because they are living in conditions that their Black skin forced them into over hundreds of years in this country. And so my worry in talking about race and statistics is that if the statistics are used to take what is a historically accurate narrative of racist origins and translate that into a modern assessment that the system is acutely racist, that essentially the powers that be will not be forced to confront the underlying issues that the chief in Norfolk or the chief in Richmond are confronting every day, which is that if I were to go to the jail and I'm going to use an analogy, a bucket analogy, because it's visually helpful for me when thinking about statistics. But if I were to take a bucket, a giant bucket, and scoop a bunch of people out of the Richmond City Jail tonight, I would find that most people in that bucket were Black. It's unbearably obvious. If I were going to go to the local jail in Powhatan, however, and I would scoop a bucket of the folks there, I would find that actually a closer, more equal number were white. But if I looked at both those buckets and I said, is there a commonality here between these buckets? I would find that most everyone is impoverished. When you're sitting in the courtroom and you're watching cases come through, I'd say 1 in 10 people are saying that they would like to hire their own lawyer. Oh, most people, and I don't have a real statistic, I can only cite anecdotal observations, but most people in the justice system are not even able to afford their own attorney. And those impoverished conditions tend to lead to conditions that result in criminal charges. And so when I look at a statistic like, for example, the Prison Policy Initiative did a 2010 census study talking about how 2,400 Black people per 100,000 in the Commonwealth were incarcerated versus 466 white people per 100,000 in the Commonwealth. I think, oh my gosh, there's something incredibly wrong here on a disparity basis. And there certainly is. But when I look into both of those buckets of white people and black people, you will find that most of the people in both of those buckets are also poor. And so my point of view on race and rates is that the rates, I think, are shocking and should be used to shock people into realizing that there is a significant problem in our criminal justice system. But my hope is that that problem will ultimately be understood as the expression of the prosecution of poverty in this country. And when we have most people, especially in the city of Richmond, about 65% of people who are below the poverty line in the city of Richmond are Black. And so if you ask why they are there, you need only look at the history of the oppression of Black people in this country to find your answer. But the solutions can't lie in some PowerPoint-based counseling session for our local officers. It has to lie in the creation of new systems that address the underlying issues of poverty from which a lot of this crime is coming. So that's my perspective on race and rates, for what it's worth.
Thank you, Tom. That definitely adds a different perspective. I think one that has not widely been articulated. And I feel like if I do not throw this to Amari, he might bust out of his face. I'm just looking at your facial expressions, Amari, and I know you have something to say, so I'm going to ask you to share.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I was trying to hide it a little bit. I think I'm honestly probably going to articulate a lot of what I'm reading in the comments right now. So I hope I'm speaking on behalf of several people, that are, on this chat. One thing I think we have to obviously recognize is that there is not just overt, blatant, acute, intentional racism, but there is a such thing called implicit bias. It's what we've been taught from the time that we were pretty much born and raised throughout life. When you look at the media, movies, television, it's often African Americans who are depicted as, criminal people. There's plenty of white people who don't even meet a Black person until they go to college, but they have this kind of innate fear or this innate distrust whenever you get on, on the elevator with them, or you leave them alone in your dorm room or something like that. That's not something that is just a product of just, historical, racism and this kind of historical setback. It's going on currently. It's present. It's going on every day. We talk about the criminal justice system. The representation of African Americans in the criminal justice system stigmatizes us with the label of, of a criminal. I myself have fit the description on at least 2 or 3 occasions for no particular reason. Not a piece of clothing that matches the description. Nothing. Just Black person walking around. What are you doing? And I think, like I said, in our upbringing, in a lot of ways, our parents and the way that they were raised and the way that they've raised us and the way that their parents raised them has taught us a lot about how we deal with other cultures and how we relate to other cultures. And if you don't kind of grow up in a diverse environment, you're basically relying on television to teach you about other cultures and about other people. So people don't have a lot of exposure to Black people who aren't somehow either playing sports or involved in the criminal justice system or making music or something like that. But another statistic that I did want to bring up is that, we had this conversation, over email chat before, is that, a Black man is 1 out of 1,000 Black men can expect to be killed by the police in their lifetime. That is astronomical. It's ridiculous, and it's absolutely frightening. We are the only ones that have to talk to our children, no matter what your economic status is. You could be filthy rich. You still have to teach your kid how to not get killed by the police if you get pulled over. So, the racial profiling is a real thing. I think obviously poverty is a contributing factor. I think you have to address all different avenues of addressing, racial disparities in the criminal justice system. But, I'm certainly not advocating that we do a PowerPoint presentation, because that would be wholly insufficient. I have much more radical ideas that we probably won't get into on this chat. But what I would say is that, I think, the color of your skin does make you a target for law enforcement. It's not just because you're in the wrong neighborhood or because you can't afford to pay your bills and you got to steal. The color of your skin makes you a target for law enforcement because that's what they've been taught through their their upbringing and through media, but also, it's not being trained out of them often enough, at least through their training, through the academy and through other police institutions. So that's my piece, and I'll give it away to everybody else for the rest of the time.
Yeah. Thank you, Amari. When you were talking, one of our pathway navigators, Tom Young, he commented, I met people in Air Force basic training in San Antonio, Texas, that had never seen a Black person in their lives. And they said, you are not like those I see on TV. And you're in Air Force basic training, you're an adult, you are over 18. And that is just, unacceptable, truly unacceptable to be that age and to never have seen or met or talked to a Black person. So those are definitely some important points. Mike, do you have anything to add to this piece of the conversation?
So, I like everything I'm hearing. I think Tom made an interesting. Am I unmuted? Can you hear me?
Yes, you're good now.
Okay. That Tom made an interesting point that I sort of simplify to this, that slavery ended over 150 years ago and Jim Crow ended 55, 60 years ago, at least by law. The vestiges of both those institutions, both those phenomena are still quite prevalent. And the people who live in circumstances disproportionately shaped by those phenomena find themselves in circumstances that lead to some degree of offending. And the problem is law enforcement and local policies generally don't take into account the chicken before the egg or the egg before the chicken. And so what happens is the response from a city, from a county, is that you see disproportionate representation among the poor and among people of color in prison populations, not because our law enforcement is racist, but because there is a higher incidence of offending in those communities. But they don't correlate the higher incidence to the historic causes. We are beginning to get that, and we can have that conversation in contexts like this. And it actually lends to a fairly fluid, compelling conversation. You try to export this outside of this chamber, and it gets wildly complicated because people don't accept that, or the notion that current behavior is impacted by a phenomena that ended 55 or 150 years ago. And they certainly aren't willing to devise policies, law enforcement policies, to account for something that ended so long ago. So I guess the challenge for me is acknowledging the historical cause, but articulating it in such a way that it resonates with contemporary policy makers and stakeholders. And the historical argument doesn't always sell. So.
That's great insight, Mike. Thank you so much for that. Maurice and Van, you've been kind of quiet up there. Do you all have anything you want to add?
Everybody brought up some really good points, and my view on this is definitely, I feel it's very deeply rooted. Going back to slavery. In the slavery times, those who owned slaves and that were here and owned most of the land, and that was in power, when all this, when that form of slavery was abolished, these people still hold that money. There was no reparations given to the slaves when they was, freed, and to the free Black people, black people don't have generational wealth, that, you know, it's a lot more, you know, white people that have generational wealth, and those people had children and taught their children these things, and a lot of this is by design. You know, a lot of these people are in power, and a lot of this is designed to be a certain way and to keep the black people still in a form of slavery on paper. You know, and when you have that going on, you know, it's no diversity. There's very little diversity when you go all the way up. Everything starts all the way up. It's obvious that it's a problem in all the way up in those who have positions of power. You know, it trickles on down. There's no one no one hold each other's accountable. There's no accountability, even the law enforcement. I recently seen a couple of videos. You know, I seen a video the other day. A female officer got fired, was on the force 18 years, and she was protecting a man that was being harassed. You know, and she got fired for standing up for what's right. You know, not all police officers are bad. It's probably 20% good, 20% bad, and the rest of them just not doing nothing because they're afraid to do something because they can lose their job for standing up. Like, you know, even when I watched the video, that she's trying to get a law passed where if a police officer was to stand up for another human being, that they won't lose their job. You know, things like that need to get passed through. You know, and all the people who have wealth and who have power, like the money isn't properly allocated through the country. You know, there's not many opportunities for people of color, you know, or people in poverty, period. You know, it's just a lot of people holding the money, and this happens to be, I mean, you know, like I previously spoke on, you know, is those people who happen to be descendants, you know, people that want to see black people down, the people that want to see people just in poverty, period. So a lot of that is deeply rooted from that, you know, opportunity and slavery on paper. That's what I see going on. I pass with that.
Yeah, thank you, Maurice. Thank you for sharing. Van, did you want to add anything? Oh, Van, you're
This
muted.
goes back so far.
Mm-hmm.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
This thing goes back so far, like Maurice was saying, you know, it just goes back so far, and that, you know, our kids are uneducated. I mean, they're being educated from the streets. You know, the projects, you know, just the other day, I rode through the projects because, you know, I had to go pick my daughter up because she's trying to follow my footsteps. So I went over there to get her, and I started thinking, you know, why is it like this? You know, why won't she listen? You know, and why don't she try, you know, to get it right? You know, but she is so used to being raised. You know, she was raised up in the projects, so you know, that's all she knows. Mm-hmm. So I don't.
Yeah.
It just roots back so far, man. I don't. You know, it just hurts so bad just to see that.
Yeah.
You know, and I really don't know how to address it.
Right. Yeah. Well, you know, and I would say I think most people have heard of some sort of discussion on the projects and what that is, but I would venture to say the majority of people have never even driven through. And if you want to see some systematic issues and issues of crime and poverty concentrated in areas, of course, all over our country, but in Richmond is what we're talking about right now, drive through there. And I guarantee that your mindset coming out is going to be different. I had never driven through until I started working in this field around 2008. And I will tell you, it was eyes wide open. So I would encourage you all to please drive through. And if you need questions or suggestions of where to go, I'm sure any of us on this call would be happy. But really educating yourself in that capacity, I think, is critical. I do want to move on because I think that we could sit here and talk about this on, and I know, but I do want to hit some more topics. We have gotten some awesome questions out there. Some of them are things that we will be talking about anyway this evening, and others are ones that we will we will hope and try to answer towards the end. So going into prosecution, really when I got to know Mike was when I was working at the jail, in the Richmond jail, as program director, and he was the Commonwealth attorney for the city of Richmond. And so most people, when they think of Commonwealth attorney, it is lock them up, throw away the key, send them away for as long as they can type of thing. And I think that's definitely some of the old school mentality. Things are changing, but not fully. But I think Mike was truly on the cutting edge of prosecuting differently, giving people different opportunities and options of things that historically had just not been done. And it really was a game changer in this city. So Mike, can you share some of the regular things that are done and then some of the innovative approaches that you and your office were able to take throughout that process?
Sure. Thank you, Sarah. I think it is more common now than it used to be for prosecutors, certainly at the state level, to consider alternatives to traditional prosecution. That is, probable cause plus arrest equals conviction equals sentence. These days, prosecutors around the country are much more open to alternatives, and you hear various iterations of it: diversion, avoidance. A popular common label for prosecutors that are open to alternatives is progressive prosecution. I don't know that in Richmond we enjoyed any of those labels. To me, it was what made sense in terms of justice, fairness, proportionality, and cost. I didn't begin to really think about alternatives to incarceration probably until 2008, when I was exposed to data from the National Institute of Corrections that made a very compelling point, which is that incarceration is typically the most expensive method of holding offenders accountable. That it is not necessarily the most effective, certainly in controlling future behavior, but it is consistently the most expensive. So, earlier I was suggesting that we need to figure out ways to approach localities other than the value-laden historical argument, which, though valid, doesn't always resonate. What always resonates to localities and stakeholders is money. And so long as you don't compromise effectiveness at the expense or for cost, you can achieve the same modicum of safety at a lower cost. In Richmond, some of the things that over time we began to focus on, and I say over time because I confess we didn't do this in the beginning, was these weren't rocket science epiphanies, but the idea that felonies did not need to be the default, right? So the goal should not be to maximize the number of felonies that come out of a court system. The goal should be to avoid felonies, to, as Tom taught me, identify responses and accountability formula that would impact future behavior more so than punish. The goal is to control future behavior on the margin, right? Things that would ensure a defendant's opportunity to continue to work to have a shot at good credit. Why? So that that person enjoyed a better chance of being a productive citizen. I remember when the Baltimore community reacted so violently to the death of Freddie Gray. And a person who was running for office made a casual but insightful comment to me. And he said, you know, if you look at the crowds, what you see by and large is a lot of people out on the street during the day who aren't working. He said, in my opinion, people who work aren't out on the streets rioting. I think there was something to that. I think also people who work generally out on the street committing crime, right? So it just seems logical to me that prosecutors and courts should craft dispositions that increase a person's likelihood to have a productive life, not make it harder for the person to have a productive life, because the latter ensures that he or she will be back and they will cost the city $24,000 to $36,000 year over year. You get no yield on that return. You don't make anything on that. And it just requires us to have an agreed tolerance for a level of risk that person A, though he may reoffend at some level, is not likely to reoffend at a significant level. And so that's a complicated notion as well, but it's one that elected officials really don't challenge communities to engage in, risk tolerance. But we were beginning to do it in the city.
Absolutely. And, you know, one thing, and then I would like for Tom and Van to share some of the reality. But, you know, one of the things that I've seen often is when we talk about alternatives to incarceration, when we talk about giving folks opportunities, maybe ones that they've never had, we're looking at young folks. We're looking at folks that don't have a very long record, you know, folks at the beginning, which is great. But what about what people that might be classified or categorized as career criminals, right? Folks that were truly warehoused growing up, warehoused in institutions, didn't have programming, didn't have that opportunity. Here we are, how many years later, and we're finally talking about opportunities, but the majority of the time what is said is, nope, the rap sheet is too long. Nope, they're too big of a risk, because instead of considering if they're finally given an opportunity once in their life, maybe they can do something different. And Van is, you know, I think was one of the first kind of guinea pigs of this, when Mike really, I think, did some different things and started shaping things for the future. And at that time, Tom worked for him as a prosecutor, and Van got an incredible experience. And here we are years later to show, wow, this really works. So I don't know which one of you want to take on kind of sharing this and the vision behind it, but I'll kind of toss it over to you all with that.
I would ask Van to go first.
All right, Van, go for it.
Yeah, well, I was okay. I just want to thank, Mike Hearn, and I really want to thank you, man, because I swear, if it wasn't for you, I would be in prison right now. And I just thank you for the opportunity. And I guess my walk in the program, showed that, I was a good candidate for a second chance, and so I really wanted to change, but I didn't know how to. I really didn't know how to change. So, once I got into the real life, it was a foundation for me. It was a safe haven that I could come home every night and be around positive stuff. And they molded me and they guided me through. And I got my own landscaping business. I'm doing good. I'm making more money than I ever made in my life. I have my driver's license that I haven't had in like 30 years. You know, I have 2 vehicles. You know, I take care, I pay my bills. You know, I'm paying off my fines. You know, I'm living a productive life, something that I haven't done in a long time. You know, and other than that, I would, you know, if I wasn't given this chance, then I would be in prison dying. I would be in prison dying because it's no way that I would have been able to make it out of prison because I had a mandatory minimum of 20 years. And for this opportunity to have came for me, I still can't believe it, you know, and I thank God for it, you know, and I just do everything I can to make sure that I do the right thing and I make the program look good. And I just want to thank you, Mike. I really do.
So, Mike, do you want to share when we came to you with this crazy idea of, hey, this guy is facing a mandatory minimum of 20 years, but you should think about an alternative for him. What were you thinking at that point? What was going on, and what led you to make these innovative decisions?
It's one thing to talk, even to push a policy down into an office. And there were some folks in the office who thought I was insane, that I was selling out the mission of the office. Tom was not one of them. Tom was someone that I would confide in. I think he and I collaborated on Van's case and discussed it. Van was unique in that he was, in my opinion, and I said this to Van in the presence of his lawyer, I said, you know, you've been at this a long time. In my opinion, you haven't done particularly well at it, because I'm looking at the conditions that led to your arrest, and I'm thinking this is not an example of a successful, thriving dealer. And then I finally ended by saying, you're too old for this, right? You will go to prison, and by the time you get out, you will be facing the end of your life. And I gave Van a very, very tough choice, though, Sarah. Just so that the record is clear, Van had to bet on himself, because Van's record was such that if Van didn't live up to the deal, Van needed to go to prison. And so I gave Van a tough choice. It was take this deal and do right by yourself. But if you don't succeed, and the reason that you don't succeed is because of something that you intentionally do, you reoffend, then you waive any right to ask for a lower sentence and you go away for 10 years. And I remember the look on Van's face, because his lawyer actually told him not to do it, or at least that's what he told me. And it was up to Van to have faith in himself and take the risk. And he's a living example of how initiatives like this can work if the subject of the case has faith in himself to do it. It really isn't a function of me. It's about the defendant and his resolve to turn his life around.
Absolutely, absolutely. Tom, as Mike mentioned, you were intimately involved in this case too, working in the prosecutor's office. And that's, as I said earlier, where you and I first had an opportunity to meet. But did you want to add anything to this?
Just very briefly to say, you know, when you think about answering the question of whether someone should be incarcerated based on how morally culpable you think they are, Van Fagans is not the candidate for that conversation. You know, when you look at Van's record, it's not good in terms of its length or exposure. And it is just those kinds of records that tend to make it politically not feasible to make these kinds of deals. And I give Mike a ton of credit for having the moral courage to do that in the face of the conventional political atmosphere that says he doesn't deserve it. You know, when I look at Van's record, and I actually think, and I'll give you a hard time for a second, man, well, this is a great risk to take. He's an old man. let's get him out there. Let's give him a shot. You know, when I look at Van's record, I think, as I think with a lot of people who have serious records when they're younger, that they are effectively getting to an age where the risk of violent reoffense especially is so low that it actually makes more sense to give them the opportunity now. Whereas when you take a culpability perspective on that question, you might think, oh, they don't deserve it. When you take a risk perspective, you think, now's the exact time.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Amari, you work for the Virginia Indigent Defense Commission. So you see this all day, every day. Share with us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I'll just jump in here real quick. First, I do want to, give a lot of credit to Tom and Mike, former prosecutors, for doing Van such a great service and allowing him an opportunity to prove himself. I honestly wish that more people would get opportunities like that. We talked a lot about mandatory minimums, not too long ago. I think that's problematic. That'll be something that will be coming up in the Virginia General Assembly special session coming up. So people that are concerned that people just get an automatic amount of time, based on their record or, the nature of the charge or whatever the case is, without any consideration to the person's, moral character, it's your opportunity to speak up loud for the legislators. And jury sentencing as well is something that's coming up with the General Assembly. Having the opportunity, even if you have a jury trial, to have a judge sentence you, because a judge can suspend time where a jury can't. A judge can, use his discretion and weigh the, mitigating factors in the case and suspend times in a lot of circumstances where a jury cannot suspend that time. And they're oftentimes very surprised and shocked to know that, oh, I have to give this defendant this amount of time. It's been a number of times where we've seen, members of a jury panel in tears, crying, wishing they had an opportunity to go back and change their mind about a conviction if they'd have known that this person would have gotten that amount of time. So some of these things that, don't make sense, where people can, use their common sense and use their discretion, the way that, Tom and Mike did. A lot of prosecutors feel like their hands are tied. There's not a whole lot they can do, especially with mandatory minimums and certain policies. But, I think that they have kind of shown the way that these things can be done, but maybe we should take some of these handcuffs off. So hopefully, with this General Assembly session coming up and with criminal justice reform being such a hot topic, some of these things will change, but it's really up to us as the citizenry to get in there and make our voices heard.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, we're going to talk even more about that, because education is a huge part. If we don't know a problem, we can't reach a solution. I say that often, but, these policy changes are absolutely critical to longer term changes. I think that the example of what Mike and Tom partnered to do in order to give Van an opportunity, and then the outcome that Van has shown for several years now, is absolutely incredible. And this is a great example of what can be done and what should be done and changes that should be made. So that's really why we wanted to share with you a specific example of things that have worked as we couple it with some of the other issues that are in the system. And to bring it kind of further from that, on the other side of things, we do see something that's, it has been quantified. The Sentencing Commission has a lot of research and data out there on it. I'm not going to run through all of it right now for the sake of time, but we know that Blacks and whites are sentenced and provided sentences differently. It is almost on a weekly basis that I will be talking to folks that are involved with real life. And it's like, oh, you got that sentence because you're white. You got that sentence because you're Black. And that is just, I mean, it's terrible. And I absolutely hate to even have to say that out loud, but that's just the harsh reality. And Maurice, I know that is something that you personally have experienced. Can you share a little bit about that?
I mean, as pertaining to a current situation, I mean, I recently graduated from the program. Just real quick, what to touch on what y'all just said too, though. I believe everyone, if you're getting a drug charge, instead of minimum sentences, it should be a mandatory for a program. Just what it does is put you in a positive atmosphere and gives people tools that they never had before. You know, their whole life they're in a negative. A lot of a lot of their life they're around negative people all the time, and they don't really have. They wanted something different, but they don't know how to get something different. And I'm speaking for myself. You know, being in the program put me in a positive atmosphere, and the what I wanted was to do was change. So it gave me the tools and the opportunities to do that and to be around positive people. So I just want to say that real quick. But um, I I um I have been clean for almost a year now. Came to the real life program, graduated. I did numerous things since I've been out, and I'm proud of myself. My family's proud of me. I never been in this position before in my life because I always been in the streets. And I go to court. I go to court. They continue it, but they're even after doing everything I've done, they still want to give me 2 years for a simple possession of a little bit of cocaine. You know, and it's and I've seen people, white people in similar circumstances, and they get ample opportunities. So I believe it was funny when Sarah was like, "Do you think it's because you're black?" And I was like, it was funny that she asked me that because I definitely pretty much was sure that's why I was. You know, even though I'm staying positive through it all. But yeah, that's pretty much what I've been going through from experience.
Right.
Thanks for letting me share that.
Yeah. Thank you. And, I think a lot of people will sit there and say, well, how do you know? How do you know? And again, for those of us who are in this every single day, we know there are absolutely no apples to apples cases, right? There is not two cases that are exactly the same holistically. But there are ones that are similar enough. And the number of times that and would venture to say that we have literally seen two extremely similar cases where the white guy gets 2 years and the black guy gets 10 years. There's no other factors there. And it's not that it's just happened once or twice. This is so often and so frequent, and not to call out any localities or jurisdictions, but we have to strategize with folks differently if they're going to X jurisdiction versus if they're going to a different one, because we know the outcome that their color of skin will lead to. And that's hugely problematic. Amari, you've seen this, haven't you, within the Sentencing Commission?
Yeah, absolutely. I just wanted to make the point real quick. I mean, and obviously your statistics are from the United States Sentencing Commission, because once again, Virginia Sentencing Commission is not tracking race. And I just want people to know that. So if you want them to do that, then you should let them know, one way or another. I do think that, is an important factor. But there are people that, don't want race statistics from the Sentencing Commission because it'll make them look bad. So I think we need to hold, the Sentencing Commission accountable to track these types of things the way that the U.S. Sentencing Commission is doing. But I think another point I want to be just in terms of like disparities and treatment. I want to give my own kind of personal anecdote real quick. I've had, and it kind of relates to mandatory minimums too. I've had, the city of Richmond is a fairly, I think, progressive jurisdiction for the most part when we're talking about, criminal sentencing. I've practiced, all across the Commonwealth, even in rural areas. But the disparities in treatment of people in different jurisdictions, even based on their skin color, is, it can be striking at times. I had a white client, a poor white client, who, it was his second conviction. It was similar to my other client situation, only in the sense that his prior violent felony adjudication was when he was a juvenile. And it was for a burglary. And then as an adult, he gets charged with a violent firearm felon. I think that anybody that's been charged with a violent firearm felon in Richmond City would be very surprised to know that he got all suspended time on that violent firearm felon charge. He had a shotgun in his car, something like that, said he was hunting. A couple years later, the exact same thing happens. He actually goes hunting and shoots and kills a deer. He knows he's not supposed to have a gun. There's no, denying it. But, once again, just a little finger wag, please don't carry a gun again. All suspended time on a second charge of a violent firearm felon. I mean, I would like to say that I was the best defense attorney in the world and they didn't have, my guy dead to rights at all, but, he admitted to everything. They could have easily locked him up. Fast forward, or I guess rewind to a case that I had in the city with a client who had a firearm felon. He also had a juvenile adjudication of a malicious wounding, where he, broke a kid's jaw in a juvenile home of some sort. It wasn't a detention home, but he was in, a foster home or something like that. He broke a kid's jaw, was charged with a violent firearm felon when he was, years later, when he was still young, maybe 19 years old, and this white guy was probably closer to 30 years old. And his friend gets pulled over. He's in the passenger side. The police start asking him questions, and he's just honest. He's what our teachers have been telling us in grade school to do with the police. Just talk to them, tell the truth, and nothing bad will happen to you. So he tells them, I got a gun in my pocket. Are you on probation? Yeah, I'm on probation from juvenile. Okay. And they find the gun on him. And obviously, and then, we ended up getting a deal of 4 years. And that was the best we could get at that point. It was either that or try the case where my client admitted that he had a gun in his pocket while, conversing with the police, admitted he was on probation. So that's a vast disparity to me, just in my own personal experience. And obviously jurisdictions can have an impact and what all the circumstances were. But, I think especially when you're talking about the sentencing guidelines and minimum, sentences, I think there can be ways to address it, but it's up to us as the public to address it.
Sarah, can I weigh in quickly?
Yes, please.
I think I'm sure there are probably studies somewhere, but I just haven't read them. But later in my career as Commonwealth's attorney, definitely not when I was a line prosecutor in the 90s, it occurred to me that one thing that may account for the disparity along race is an implicit assumption that convictions and particularly jail sentences are less impactful and less harmful to people of color, particularly African Americans, because there is this lower value placed on the life of an African American. And I don't mean that in the context of police shootings, right? Which is the more recent context for this notion of the value of Black life. But somewhere in the system, there is this thread that assumes that a young Black kid is not likely to have or to enjoy as successful a future as a white counterpart. Therefore, significant time is going to do less harm. And so it's an easier process. It's an easier reaction to hit a young Black kid with a sentence that includes time than it is a white counterpart whom you sympathize as suffering harsher consequences because of the sentence. I know it's counterintuitive, and I may not be articulating it well, but I know exactly what I feel, and I really think there's something to it. And sociologists would probably validate it somehow.
Yeah, absolutely. The last little thing I will add, and I hesitate to say it, but this is a real conversation and real things. there was somebody that I know who was brutally raped in college. She was in her dorm room bed and brutally raped. White, very pretty young girl. And she was raped by a well-dressed, well-groomed white guy. And the prosecutor literally told her, he's a white man. He's not going to get much time. And the fact that something like that is said because it's a truth of what is going absolutely should make all of our stomachs just turn upside down and show us that that's a problem and that's an issue. But I know that we are running short on time, and I really do want to talk about plea bargains. We've had a lot of comments, people asking to talk about that, and that, Mike, is something that you, again, as Commonwealth Attorney, really worked hard on changing our system in Richmond as it relates to that. You know, one thing that you said at a meeting, a CCJB meeting years and years ago, was talking about, you know, the purpose of plea bargains is to allow somebody out of jail but have money on the line so that they would show up for court. But studies have shown that that's not true, that because people pay money, you know, a plea bargain, pay money to get out of jail, that doesn't necessarily dictate whether they will or will not show up for court. There's other factors that dictate that. And I just recall from that, a lot of changes were made within your office in the way that plea deals were offered. So can you share some about, yes, what you did, but then also racially, how this system is completely broken?
Sure, I will, and I'll try to be quicker this time with my comments. The money condition for pretrial release is a little different than plea bargains, right? But there's studies that have invalidated the correlation between bail and failing to return or returning to court. And factors like stable housing and employment are much more reliable predictors of a person's likelihood to return to court than is a $5,000 bond requirement, right? On the other hand, plea bargains, the contemporary criticism of plea bargains is that prosecutors exert this unfair leverage to force people into accepting deals and convictions for crimes they didn't commit as a means of mitigating or minimizing their losses. People tend to conflate, though, the state system with the federal system. I think state prosecutors have a lot more flexibility than federal prosecutors, and they actually exert considerably less leverage. I think in the state system, particularly in the city of Richmond, there was no assumption that if an offender went to trial in the city of Richmond, he was going to get convicted. You know, I heard my friend Amari talking about abolishing jury sentences. I would tell people all the time in the city of Richmond that it is a much more defendant-friendly venue for purposes of jury sentencing than it is a Commonwealth-friendly venue, using that term friendly colloquially. So plea bargains really operate to move cases through the system. I don't think any person in the state system, well, strike that. There are people who eat charges and who eat convictions because they want to avoid potentially draconian consequences. Right? You can always find examples of that. But what plea bargains serve to do in the state system is move an incredible volume of cases through the system. And so already I see your heads, the gears turning in your heads, and you're going to make a valid point. Why don't you reduce the volume of cases in the system so you don't have to rely so much on plea bargaining? I think that's a valid point. But until we get there, if you don't have plea bargains, and assuming that the lawyers are at arm's length and equally competent, then you create this incredible backlog of cases. And so we've taken some steps to relieve the consequences of that by allowing people to be out on pretrial release. But if you're in a jurisdiction that still uses cash bonds and you don't have plea agreements and cases don't get to trial soon, then you end up remaining detained for a longer time sometimes. So I just want to encourage people to appreciate the complexity of plea bargains and resist the temptation to throw out the baby with the bathwater. Although I know this is a sensitive topic.
Yeah, absolutely. Amari, you got something. I can see it. Unmute yourself, Amari.
Sorry.
There you go.
There we go. No, I definitely, appreciate everything that Mike had to say regarding pretrial release and plea bargains. I do fundamentally have an issue with the cash bail system because it penalizes people, for poverty. I think if you can make a decision whether a person is dangerous or a flight risk and say they need to stay in jail until you can prove otherwise, that's one thing. Although I think the burden should be on the Commonwealth to show that this person is a flight risk and is dangerous. But certainly I'm not placing the blame of this at anyone's feet, especially not in this room, any particular person or even prosecutors in general, because this was a court mandated and a magistrate granted bond. But Sandra Bland had a $2,500 secured bond that she had to pay. For $250, she could have got out of jail that day. And, her family and friends, they struggled to come up with $250 to send to Sandra Bland. And by the next morning, she was hanging from a roof in the cell. And I'm not saying, I don't want to, speculate on exactly what happened, but my guess is that had she been able to get out of jail that day, she wouldn't have died, at least within that 24-hour period. But, as far as plea bargains are concerned, I think it's problematic when people have to sit in jail on a monetary cost. And, some people, of course, they will take their lumps one way or another, but there's definitely scenarios where people, they just want to get out of jail. I've had a guy that was, he sat in jail for 30. I wanted to pay his bond so bad. He had on a $1,000 bond for like trespassing. I wanted to pay his bond so bad. But obviously I could not do that. He didn't have any family or friends in the area, which was problematic for him, but he also didn't have a substantial record. It was just like, you're going to be held accountable for, I believe it was a trespass or something like that, or pay largely something very minimal. So he just sat there. And then when it kind of came time for his hearing, the prosecutor made him an offer. I told him the offer. He was like, do I get out of jail? That's all he cared about. He didn't care about, his criminal record. I explained it to him over and over again. Like, this misdemeanor is going to travel with you for the rest of your life. Hey, if we try the case and we lose, you're probably going to get out of jail anyway. He's like, man, I'm not trying to deal with this. I'm trying to go home like ASAP, like right now. I'm like, they're not going to release you for several hours anyway. I'm trying to convince him. He just didn't want to go through the general hassle. And I imagine that had he walked into that courtroom, not from the back, from a jail cell, his perspective would have been different. But, until, we make, I think, a reasoned and informed decision about cash bail and how it should be applied, we're going to end up with results like that. And it's, super unfortunate.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Tom, did you want to add anything to this piece? I know you've got experience with it.
Yeah, only that I think plea bargains, for the most part, to Mike's point, for my clients, they tend to result in discounts from expectation at trial. That's what a plea bargain is supposed to be, a discount from an expectation at trial. So if I'm thinking about what does my client's best day at trial look like, I can really only advise that person to take a deal if there's an offer that discounts that. So for the most part, plea bargains, at least for my clients, tend to be, I hate to use this word, but semantically speaking, it's accurate. It tend to be an opportunity, at least in terms of the alternative of going to trial. But I think that plea bargains are really worrisome and impactful, especially in two situations. When someone's best day at trial is a felony conviction, but they could avoid jail time, but they're not a felon yet. So that is a life-changing event in which the leverage effectively will turn them into a felon. I've had that happen to a couple of clients that were pretty impactful to me. And then the other situation, Mike's accurate that, you know, the federal pressure that they can impart is much, much greater than in the state system. But drug dealing especially, and we saw it in the case of Van, can rack up mandatory minimums for in generally weak evidentiary cases very quickly. I mean, I'm representing a gentleman right now who's facing 30 years of mandatory minimum time due to the presence of multiple substances. His record necessitates that charging posture, but the evidence is pretty weak. And I really want to tell this guy to go to trial, and he wants to go to trial. And I truly think deep down we can beat it. But if he doesn't, that's a life sentence. It's a life sentence for him. So it's a situation where, honestly, a sort of good outcome in that case is going to be around 5 years. And I don't think that 5 years for anybody is a good idea.
Absolutely. John Shinholzer of the McShin Foundation just commented, we need to end mandatory sentencing, stop crushing mentally ill people, especially those with substance use disorders. The state should fund alternative options such as recovery supports, including recovery residence living. It's a lot less expensive than correctional costs, as well as a better reduction. Absolutely. That is a solution I think all of us on this could certainly get behind. It seems common sense to me, but unfortunately might not be such common sense to others, which is why we haven't seen it widespread. I wanted to jump over to a couple of questions. I do want to wrap up by 8 o'clock for the sake of everybody's time. Kathleen asks, whoever wants to answer can go for it. Do mandatory minimums make plea agreements more worrisome?
I think mandatory minimums make plea agreements more appealing, you know, for the very reason that Tom just described. When Tom's talking to his client and he has to describe the best day being an absolute win, and very often a plea agreement, even on a mandatory minimum, contemplates something less than the statutory minimum, then that person has a tough decision to make, because when they go to trial, Tom's got to run the table. If Tom doesn't run the table, then that person is going to end up with more time than is often offered in the plea agreement. That's my sense of the interplay between plea agreements and mandatory minimums. Now, a lot of prosecutors will leverage mandatory minimums to get more time out of defendants, and they'll do what's called stacking charges. I use a gun to rob the other 6 people on the screen, and so each of that gun usage in each of those crimes carries an additional 3 to 5 years in and of itself. So already I'm looking at 6 times 3, or what is it? 6 times 3 for the first and 5 for the others. I can't remember anymore. But I'm looking at 18 years. Let's say I'm looking at 18 years of gun time. So when Amari comes to me with an offer that says you can either take 18 years of gun time or go to trial and risk 18 years of gun time plus time for the underlying robberies, well, then that's a tough choice for me to make, because now I've got to roll the dice that Tom wins outright in the trial with Amari, or I could easily end up with more time than is on the table, even though I beat some of the charges.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know what the answer to that is. I'm not yet prepared to pass judgment on the prosecutor's decision to charge the gun charge for each robbery. If I rob the 6 of you, which of you comes into my office as a victim and says, but don't charge the offender for putting the gun in my face?
Yeah.
Only charge for the other 5 people. I'm willing to eat the gun. Most people don't feel that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Anybody else on that one?
I'll just quickly jump in and say it depends. When we're talking about like that prior, firearm felon case that I was talking about, it's like a weird, mandatory minimum case because it's also the maximum that you can get in a violent firearm felon, 5 years regardless, if you get convicted. And so that certainly leverages, people into positions. And I'm just using that as an example where, especially, usually there's oftentimes where, it's really not much of a defense that you can put up. And so, you, like my prior client, you'll take any amount of time that's less than the maximum, which at that point was 4 years. And, I had a lot of other creative things that I wanted to do with that, and just say like, let's try it. But it's not my case, to just try it. It's his case. And he doesn't want to take the risk of getting 5 years and then waiting for the Court of Appeals to make a decision, a year or two down the line. Then that's his choice. I mean, it really depends, but I mean, you're absolutely right. If it comes down to a choice of, looking at mandatory time and pleading, then yeah, I think it helps the plea agreement. But, from the defense side, it's kind of hard. It does take away a lot of your leverage, but at the same time, I think it gives the prosecutors kind of a baseline to work with. Obviously, if that's not the maximum amount of time, you could always recommend more, or, a judge could give you more time. But to the extent, we're talking about, what leverage, if any, a defendant has, I'd say none.
Yeah, thank you. So the final question here is similar to what we've just been talking about, but sentencing guidelines are the point of serious debate. Have any of you seen sentencing below guidelines when the defendant is white versus when the client is Black?
I'd like to talk about this briefly because the guidelines are really only half the picture, because guidelines apply to charges. So a prosecutor can amend charging documents, and by way of amending the charging documents, can essentially elect to use different guidelines. And so the question of whether there's a downward departure from the guidelines essentially is like a question that assumes that they're being sentenced on the originally charged guidelines. As a prosecutor, there are a lot of things you can do to get a guideline sentence, even when the evidence would support charges that would carry more than your resolution. In other words, you're achieving a downward departure on a different guideline set. It's not recorded that way. And so I think it would be really tough to sort of answer this question thoughtfully, because there's so much play in terms of the plea bargaining process on what guidelines you're ultimately sentenced on.
Interesting. Yeah. Thank you. Anybody else? So I know that we could go on and on and on, probably until the early morning hours, but I think we all need a good night's rest tonight. We'll just say that. But what I do want to say is we plan on having these more often, because I think right now we have just began to really scratch the surface. Our next one that we have, a date is not scheduled yet, so you will see that forthcoming with a date soon. We're really going to talk about, today the focus has really been talking about problems. The next one is going to be really talking about what are solutions and what can be done. So we're excited to bring that to you. Probably have some same faces and then have some new faces as a part of that conversation. But just to end us tonight, I would like to give everybody 1 to 2 minutes max to share final thoughts and what somebody can do now if they feel so moved to help, with the problem. So I'll just kind of go chronologically through my screen, and Tom, you're next to me, so I'll toss it over to you.
Okay, well, I'm going to have to pitch your program and mine real quick. You can, of course, get involved in supporting the Real Life program. I'm so lucky to have Sarah as a founding board member, also on the Virginia Holistic Justice Initiative. If you're interested in learning more about what we're doing to advocate for an end to the incarceration of nonviolent people, you can go to vahji.com. And shout out to Mr. Chappelle. Hope you're being safe out there, my man.
Yes, and I am going to put the website that Tom mentioned in the comments below. I will tell you, it is an absolutely incredible organization. It is the, I think, attorney version of real life. So it is literally a holistic defense approach so that their clients are represented holistically. You know, talking to Tom, he will share with you how some of his folks may be well-intentioned, but if they don't have a ride to court, they're not going to court, and that creates just a whole nother problem. And most often attorneys will say, well, too bad, that's not my job to figure out your ride. Tom will go pick them up in his own car. So when he says holistic, that is what he means. It's incredible what he is doing, and truly an honor to be a part of it. So Amari, you're up next.
Yeah, I'll give out a shout out to Tom too. I'm also on the advisory board for the Virginia Holistic Justice Initiative. So, you know, doing great work, obviously. I just want to, you know, kind of reiterate what I've said, you know, throughout this chat, which is, you know, for everybody that's wondering, you know, what we can do, what we should do, I think it's continue to make your voices heard. Obviously do it, you know, safely and lawfully. Voices heard, contact your local delegate or senator and let them know these are things that you want to see. These are things you can care about, that you care about. Mobilize as many people as you can.
Mm-hmm.
The session is coming up next month.
Yep.
So less than 4 weeks. So I would suggest that everybody just get prepared.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, thank you. It looks like, oh, I'm sorry, I was frozen for a moment. I think we're back. Thank you so much, Amari. And we are going to make sure that more information, especially about that upcoming session and things that people can do to support it, and advocate and lobby on behalf of certain things that are critical, we will make sure to get that information out. Mike, you're up next.
Yep, thank you. So I too am very excited about your program and about Tom's and similar ones. I'm going to take a slightly different approach to this question, though, and encourage our audience to be more involved in your elections for Commonwealth's attorney. Frankly, run, right? Amari, right? I hate to put you guys on the spot. The Amaris and the Toms of the world, I God bless you for what you're doing, but communities need you in positions of authority and leverage. And there's clear value to what you're doing for your clients, but you can also do it on a broader level in office. So I just hope people, you know, I remember when I was campaigning, I would struggle to get more than 20 or 30 seconds from a voter. And maybe that's because I was a rotten campaigner, but more likely it's because people don't want to be bothered. They just want the justice system to deal with offenders. They don't want to deal with the complexities of the justice system.
Mm-hmm.
And it requires patience, and it requires contemplation and depth. And I just hope people are more open to that in the coming races.
Absolutely. Catherine is already hashtagging Amari Tom 2020. So we could, I think maybe can we do a, you know, kind of a governor, lieutenant governor thing for that office? Well, we might know some people who know.
We need them local. We need them local.
Well, oh no, I'm saying on the local level,
Gotcha.
governor, lieutenant, but on the local level, yeah, you can't go anywhere, guys. You're stuck in Richmond. Van.
I throw all my support behind Tom. Yeah.
There you go. Van, you're up next.
Okay, I just want to say just lead by example and let your voice be heard, and keep my brother Maurice free because he got the same DNA as me.
Oh, that is great. That is great. Maurice, we'll let you wrap us up, man.
Well, all right. Well, I think that everybody watching can continue to brainstorm, come up with ideas, and bring it to real life, bring it to the next discussion, and everyone continue to be the change that we want to see in society. That's all I have. Good night, everybody.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, everybody, so much for being a part of this conversation. Thank all of you all for listening in and for your interaction. The comments have been so wonderful. I'm sorry that we can't get to all of them. As I posted on here, if you would like us to keep you updated on upcoming things and ways that you can get involved, please email or message us on Facebook, and we absolutely will add you to the list so that you don't miss anything. And I just hope that everybody has a wonderful night, and please speak up, stand up, and do something to help make a difference. Good night, everybody.
Night.
All right. That was good.